A very, very, very good morning and welcome. My name is Lester Kiewit. Thanks so much for joining us in this year's 2022 Open Book Festival. Thank you so much for giving up your Sunday morning to be here with us. And we really appreciate that you'll be part of this conversation over the next 60 minutes or so, where we talk about our transformative moments and why who we are, what we are, how we perceive ourselves is so important when we're telling the stories that are important to us. Also ask the question, whose story is it to tell? As I said, my name is Lester Kiewit. I work for Cape Talk Radio. It's my job usually to direct conversations on air. Often, I like to overtake conversations because I'm inspired so much and I try and grasp at the very, very fine strands of what some of our very interesting guests say. And that is what I'm looking forward today to, over the course of the next 60 minutes, not do a book report on these great books that these three authors have written, but really dig into who they find themselves now and in the past. So I kept this as a little bit of a surprise, and it was all linked to where I see this conversation going. You know who these people are because there's a reason why you are here today, because you are either familiar with their books or you were drawn to the description of themselves, the behind the book or in the program. So I want to ask our authors today. I'll start with Siphiwe and Ndlovu. How would your mum have described you at 15 years old?
She would have said, and she would have been right, she's angry, opinionated, and bangs a lot of doors.
That fits all 15-year-old boxes. Onke Mazibuko, thanks so much for joining us. How would your folks have described you on a panel here this morning at the age of 13, 14, 15 years old?
I think they probably would have said they don't know me because they put me in boarding school when I was 5, and I stayed there for 8 years. So I always felt like a boogeyman when I came home because I'd be this little child that no one could figure out, you know. But they love to let me roam and do my own thing. And I think that's been a story of my life as far as how I've related with them. I seem to get closer with them as the years go by. But yeah, I definitely think they would have said, we don't know, we're trying to figure them out. So.
Welcome, thank you so much. You write quite intimately about your mother in your book. At the age of coming into being as a peri-adult at that age, how would your mother have described you?
I think my mother would likely describe me as soft. Yeah, I think soft, tender, sweet, and beautiful.
I just want to say equally beautiful, but the glow up is amazing. but definitely,
It wouldn't be a lie.
the experiences that you write, Welcome, of trauma, particularly related to mothers and parents, you write from a very personal point of view. Firstly, before I get into that, a memoir. Usually memoirs are reserved for people who have lived long, full lives I'm not saying 60 years old, but 60s, 70s, 80s. We're in the middle age group here. Why a memoir right now?
Well, my life has been full. I like to believe. But I did actually have a lot of back and forth about, I knew I would write this book, but I thought maybe it might be my 10th, 14th book, you know? But yeah, it became urgent for me to write it for my own self, for my own healing process. it became very important for me to write it, and I couldn't not write it. So, yeah, in a way, I had to write the book at the time that I did. And also because I think I was saying in one of the other panels that I was scared. I lost my mom when I was 12, which was very young, and it was, like you said, quite traumatic. And I was always scared that I would forget. I would forget the love between us. I would forget her face, how she smelled like, how she loved me, how she looked at me. I was scared all of those memories by the time I'm an adult would be nowhere to be found, and I would have no idea of who my mom was. So I wrote it. The urgency to write it was also holding on to these memories and making them tangible, so that if in my old age, should I, have memory loss and forget everything, I know that it exists somewhere. And also another reason is that I had to honor her life, because she was very young. She was a year older than me now. Like, I'm 31. She passed when she was 32. And so I always felt like she disappeared and life just moved on. And there was nothing in the world to mark the beautiful existence, the beautiful spirit, the beautiful soul that, I had this powerful encounter with. And yes, I'm beautiful and gorgeous and all those things, but it's because of my mom. And I always wanted that to be prefaced, that, all this fabulosity doesn't come from me. It comes from, a greater source of fabulosity. That was my mom.
I have a confession, Onke. I've lived in Cape Town, worked in Cape Town my entire life, 38 years of life, except 8 weeks when I was deployed to East London. So I was a resident of Slamis, Imonte, for 8 weeks. Not my favorite time, but I got to know a great deal, particularly of primarily the urban culture around East London. Ndansani, where I spent a bit of time. But tell me then your relationship, as you say, you were sent to boarding school at a very, very young age. How does that reflect on who Onke is now? I'm going to be ending off the conversation of how would your parents describe you now after the session. So how does that reflect on who Onke becomes?
It's very interesting because, so my surname is Zulu, Mazibuko, but my parents are both Xhosa. And I was born in KZN, and I lived there until I was about 11, 12. And I was in boarding school in KZN. But my family moved back to the Eastern Cape when I was about 11, I think it was. And so for the longest time in my life, if I was in KZN, I'd tell people I'm Xhosa. And then when I'm in Eastern Cape, I tell people I'm Zulu. Because in both places or everywhere I've gone, I never quite fitted in with the groups of where I was. People could immediately tell that this guy is just different from the people here. And also, having been in KZN in a boarding school setup at a private school, and then going to East London in a public school, suddenly being a day scholar, and living with my two siblings who had also been in other boarding schools, and now suddenly I had to get used to them. It was a big shake-up of my life in terms of how I was figuring myself out and who I was going to grow up to be. And I think it started a period in my life where I definitely went into my shell. And for the longest time, I always spoke about how high school were the worst years of my life. But when I reflect back on them, and especially now that I've written a book which is based on a young protagonist going through high school, I realized actually those were formative years in a good way. And a lot of those challenges that I went through at that time, I see them as strengths now. They're things that I feel have made me the person that I am, not just as a writer, but just as a human being. And East London as a place, I don't know, for those of you who've been to East London, it's if you've been being in a place that's busier or bigger, East London is not the place you're trying to go to. Or if you consider yourself any kind of creative, it's not the place you want to go to.
But it's also a very interesting place in where there is this meeting of either deeply rural Eastern Cape, but
Yes.
at the same time, the privilege of a private school. I found that very interesting with many of my friends who are from the Eastern Cape but went to a private all-boys school, and with all the tropes and monikers and slurs that come from being a young black man but speaking with a private school accent. How does that play on one's figuring out of space? Do you take that on completely? Oh, this is who I am. I cannot release myself from my parents choosing for me to be in this particular educational system, but at the same time still connected to who I am abroad as part of a people. So how does that reflect on you?
I mean, it was quite, I would say it would form part of the challenges that I went through, because on the one side, now remember the Eastern Cape also has a strong emphasis on Xhosa boys becoming men. So now on the one side, you at an all-boys school, which is very Western, and there's certain concepts of what masculinity looks like there, which I personally struggled with. And then on the other side, there's the whole initiation thing, which was also something that, having been born in KZN where it doesn't happen, I thought, well, I'm gonna skip that. But you get to the Eastern Cape and it's not a choice, because your friends are gonna look at you differently. You know, they will consider that they left you behind. You stayed a boy as they moved on. So trying to figure out at that time, will I go in, will I not go in? How will I do it? And it also happened that when I was 12, my parents split up. And my older brother he became a man through my mother's side of the family. So they had a different surname from his, which technically is not the way you're supposed to do it. So when my time came, I refused to go, but I didn't know at the time why. It didn't feel right, even though I'd grown up with my mother's family. I didn't know my father's family. And when he came back into my life a few years later, he was like, you don't know what you've done, but you've done the right thing here. And for me, it was the thing of wanting to know his side of the family, not realizing the bigger implications from a surname and clan names perspective. But then that forming part of me figuring myself out as a human being growing up into an adult. And also trying to deal with the things that I couldn't speak about. You know, the book touches on things of mental health and suicide. And I know, well, if someone had asked me at the time, were you depressed or going through these things, I'd probably say no. I didn't think I was. But now that I'm a psychologist and I reflect back and I look at the symptoms, I'm like, oh my goodness, I probably was. But it didn't seem like something that was available for me to say, that's what I have, this is what I'm going through.
I want to reflect on how it inspires the debut novel. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. But 18 years in the US, Siphiwe, does deciding where home is dictate how you tell a story? Where is home?
So for me, home is definitely the City of Kings, which is Bulawayo, which is where I live now. When I first wrote my first novel, The Theory of Flight, I was in the United States, and I think I was very reluctantly part of a diaspora, a Zimbabwean diaspora. When I left in '97, the farm invasions in 2000 hadn't happened, so a lot of Zimbabweans were still in Zimbabwe. And then as I was, finishing college, a lot of people started leaving the country, and I found myself part of an identity that I had not chosen for myself, which was being a diasporan. So I was really trying to come to terms with what home is in the first novel. I think now, since I live in Bulawayo, I'm very clear about where home is, if not always clear about if it's going to always be that home. So yeah, no, it's, I think home is where you feel the most comfortable, the most, a stronger sense of belonging. And I think for a lot of Zimbabweans, for the past 20, 30 years, that has been maybe the defining thing, is like, where is this place? Because where we come from is, has a lot of push factors, let me put it that way. And where we're pulled to also ends up having a lot of push factors, so we find ourselves in a bit of a no man's land. But or no person's land, sexist language. But yeah, so it's that kind of investigation of who we are and who I am, and yeah.
Speaking on the parental or even the grandparental links, you have said, and I've read that you come from a tradition of storytelling. Your grandmother, you cite as one of the biggest influences in your life. She was a storyteller herself. How do you learn to be a storyteller if they would describe you as angry and moody, keeps to themselves? How do you sit still and absorb? Does it get passed through the genes, or in that moment of moody anger, the clouds around us,
Okay.
you subconsciously get absorbed by the storytelling of your grandmother?
No, so I wasn't always angry and moody. I was a very happy child. I think I was angry and moody because I was coming up against something that I didn't have a word for, or systems that I didn't know how to talk about. And one of those was patriarchy, and the other one was racism. So I went to a predominantly white, I suppose in this country you'd call them Model C schools. And there was a lot that was happening, I think like you were saying, there was a lot that's happening and you don't know how to put words to it. And so you sort of like withdraw into yourself. And the person who's supposed to have the answers didn't go through the same experience because she grew up in Rhodesia and you're growing up in Zimbabwe, and her experiences are very different. So it was not having the language, but as I grew older, I realized that I did have the language. My grandmother and my grandfather had given me the language to talk about what it was that I wanted to talk about. My grandmother was a phenomenal storyteller, and she just brought things to life. My grandfather had been a political detainee, and he made me understand issues of justice and injustice in a very, I think, empathetic way. He was not an angry person. So yes, I was angry at 13 and 15, but for very different reasons. I was banging doors because I didn't have the language to say, this is just so unjust. And I lost my grandfather when I was 13, and we had been very close. And, people just expect you to accept loss without sort of like speaking it all the time. And I didn't know how to do that. So yeah, it was just a very trying time. But I did inherit, I think I write now because I was given the tools at a very young age to be able to then work through these very difficult things that had happened.
2013, I think, was a year. It was the Roads Must Fall movement. Welcome. I was on UCT's field covering it from a news perspective, seeing the crane.
I saw you on the telly.
Oh, yes. It was a fun time. I also realized I'm old because all the young people started saying you're old, and there was a big pushback, particularly with mainstream media that time. But it was a great time because it gave young people the language of what they're experiencing, particularly when we talk about identity, how we push back against patriarchy, how women find their place and people identify as women find their place in that particular movement. Also, the language of queer identity. I estimate you're probably around about my age. Were you also a bit disappointed that you weren't 18 years old in 2013 and then finding the vocabulary? It's always been there, but all of a sudden, a groundswell of theories and simply a place for belonging in a Roads Must Fall and later Fees Must Fall movement. I know you've also been part of politics at Wits University, but gosh, it would have been lovely to be 18 years old in 2013.
It would have been lovely, but there was something. I felt like I was 16 or 18 when the protest happened, because there was definitely a kind of awakening of the spirit, and I had a kind of renewed rage around the things I have always been uncomfortable with, and I was no longer as scared of speaking out against or pushing back and holding truth to account, or power to account rather. There was something about how that moment, everyone coming together to say this, enough is enough, that really shifted something rather radical in me, in a way I hadn't seen before. And I had said, part of it, I think part of the bravery, the courage was I was at Rhodes University to do my master's degree in journalism and media studies. And the reason, even though I was involved with student politics at WITS, it was still within the bounds of making sure I would not get expelled from the university. So it was very cautious because I needed to get my degree. And when I went to Rhodes University, I felt like this master's degree would be nice, but I don't need it. And so with this privilege or some kind of power I have to say, I already have a degree. If they want to kick me out, so be it. But I will speak out and I will push back. I like this. Every time I think back to those moments, I just remember. Plus, I was a student journalist and I was editor for OPTV, which was a student broadcast publication, and we did a lot of coverage as well around the protests. And I just remember how I had this feeling that I could bulldoze my way into anyone's office and demand an interview and demand answers, and so that was, for me, that was new. This kind of rage and the urgency that enough is enough and we have to do something and we have to do it now, I felt very young. It felt as though I was only coming into myself and really being comfortable enough to not mince my words, and speak honestly and vulnerably from an honest place. Speak honestly from an honest place. But to speak honestly and truthfully to myself, because before I had to mince my words around a lot to make sure that I was still safe and that I did not, offend the establishment enough to be kicked out of it. And certainly my family, I remember my grandma was like, if they ill-treat you wherever you're going to get this degree, you are not without a home. Just know that you can always come back. And that love from home, knowing that if they really did kick me out, it wouldn't be an awkward conversation at home. They would know that I did my best to stand up for the right thing, and they trust my character. They know me to be someone with integrity. So if I said they kicked me out because I was standing up for the right thing, it wouldn't have been an issue with my family. And I'm very grateful to have had that kind of love and support, that enabled me to stand up so boldly and to myself.
I want to reflect on one of the passages in your book. First, as we've identified, I'm the one who's probably been grounded in one city for the longest out of the three of you. So, also particularly living in a city of Cape Town, I did not have to apply for res. I took a train and a taxi to get to what was then Pentec every day. I do not necessarily have the experience of friends who had to travel long ways and deal with NSFAS and hostels and residences. But you write with complexity, but also a tenderness of your uncle taking you the first day, navigating you through the taxi ranks, offering you a little bit of cash, and on your first entrance at Wits University. Just reflect on that particular moment as we're currently in the theme of finding freedom at a tertiary level.
Yes, I remember that moment very fondly. I had been admitted to Wits, and I was. We found an accommodation place for me to stay. It wasn't res, it was outside res. So I had to move in on the 1st to start the lease. But orientation week was like a week before. So in the week building up to the 1st, I traveled from Midrand, where my uncle lived. But for the very first day, my uncle took the taxi with me to show me the route, the taxi route, and so I could know how to get to Wits. And yes, we walked. My uncle is not a man of many words. He doesn't talk a lot. He's very quiet. But there was so much unspoken love between us that day when he walked me to university. And he took me in after I lost my mom. When I was 12 and I had just lost my mom, my family took me to go live with him because he's been the breadwinner and they thought, my future is better off if I'm under his care. And I stayed there for a year, but after a year, I was like, I was feeling lonely despite getting twice as much pocket money. I was feeling lonely and I needed to go where my mom had had called home. And so, I moved back. I had already moved back. I had already moved out. So there was so much love, unspoken love, between us. And it still goes back to the point about, when you are loved, as I feel I have been by my family, you are emboldened to walk more proudly, on the streets. And the kids at Wits, of course, were being dropped off in beautiful Mercedes-Benz and Range Rovers. But I didn't feel that I was lacking. I didn't feel that I was poor. I didn't feel that I was poor because of the love I had been shown. And the love they showed me also wasn't just for me, they did it for my mom. My uncle, took me on that route and took me under his care because of the love he had for his sister. And I felt that love he had for his sister when he walked me down the street to Wits. But just before we got to the gate, when I saw the Wits sign, I was like, okay, I think I can take it from here. Thank you. I think I can take it from here. I wanted to be like, okay, now this is my
big
journey.
school.
Yeah, and actually that was when that moment I was like, because I've always gone by Mandla, Welcome Mandla. I'm happy with either. I prefer actually both. But that was the moment I also decided that when I leave here, when I leave school and I leave home and I pursue my independent life, I will be welcome. And when I told my uncle I'll take it from here, that was welcome saying, I will take it from here. And I've loved that love I've had allowed me to be free to rediscover myself, to immerse myself fully into the university experience, and to make the most out of it because I was also there for my uncle, for my mom, for my aunt, for my grandma, my great-grandma, and everyone who came before me who wasn't able to walk through those corridors. When I walked through those corridors, I had the great sense of them being there with me. And so it was very important for me to make the most out of it and do as much, and I did a lot, to do as much as I could to get the most out of the experience so that my mom could also get some life.
Just want to again welcome you again. We're talking transformative moments and how it reflects on why we tell stories and how we tell stories, how we identify ourselves in telling our stories, whether we are telling our own stories or whether we have liberty to tell other people's stories. I think it's very important. Remember, we'll save and we'll reserve about 15 minutes towards the end of this session where you are then free to ask questions and interact with the panel. So keep them ready. We'll be with them in a short while. But Onke, let's talk about, I think we're on a path now of growth, of how we change. Before the audience, you and I and Siphiwe had a conversation of how we've changed since maybe our formative younger years. You were a big fan of The Matrix once upon a time. We also spoke about how a book that you could possibly change your mind on. We spoke about Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah.
of how we can change our mind. Now, you said Catch in the Rye is largely a catalyst for this particular novel, second verse. I've had my ideas change on Catch on the Rye. I was also 15 years old, and gosh, if I had a poster of Holden Caulfield, I probably would have had it on my wall. Now, I'm like, I don't think I like Holden Caulfield anymore. Let's talk about identifying something in yourself now, particularly in your role, your professional role as a psychologist. Your book starts with a young boy being hauled into not a principal's office, a teacher's office, because he wrote a very descriptive essay on suicide. Let's talk about Onke's growth in realizing who he is that leads to second verse.
Okay, so the reason why Catch on the Rye played such a big role in influencing this book is that I read it in high school as part of set work, and I remember really hating the story, thinking this boy has just got problems. And then when I had dropped out of university, a few years later, like 2-3 years later, I read it again, and I was shocked at how much I could identify with the character. And then I read it again when I was in my 30s, and I knew then that if I ever go on to write a story, I have to write a coming-of-age story, because this is telling me just how much I've changed. And it was the same as I was saying with the Matrix movie, that when I watched it in high school, I thought it was a lot of hype. And then when I watched it as a weed-smoking dropout, I was like, that's the answer right there.
I think it's the weed that gave you all the answers here. But continue, sorry.
Yeah, and I was like, that's the story right there. But there was something that Welcome was saying right now that resonated with me quite a lot. The role that my sister played in my life, my older sister, she passed away last year, but I felt like when she passed away, it was a celebration of her life because of how many people that she had looked after. She was a social worker by profession, and she took in so many people and treated them as siblings. But the story of going to an institution when your life has literally been shattered. So the year after my parents got divorced and we got pulled out of private schools, changed provinces, I'm going to public school thinking it's the worst thing in the world, even though it was a very good school I was going to. And now suddenly I have to take a taxi, and I'm 13, and I'm thinking, what is this? Like, I don't know what this life is. And my sister used to wake up with me and walk me to the place where we'd stop the taxi, and she would do this and stop the taxi, and she'd be telling me things will be okay. And there'd be times when she wasn't even saying much, but she's just with me on this journey. And I would go to the school, and then when I get there, I go into my shell, and I'm miserable the whole day, and then I come back, and she's there waiting again. And I think she played a very important role in recognizing at an early stage in my life that I see where your potential is going. And even when I dropped out, my mother was all over me angry. Like, she wanted to disown me. And my sister was like, leave him, he knows what he's doing. But now that I've understood her and the kind of person that she is, or the kind of person that she was, she probably just needed to show me the belief, not knowing necessarily where this journey is going.
How much channeling of your own teenage self is it? Because when I read it, it's the language of a teenage boy, punk ass. The punk ass teacher, that's how teenagers generally speak in that limited, but sharp-tongued vocabulary. You've channeled. Are you speaking from yourself, or do you go back and what words did I say? How did I talk? Is this what I sounded like?
The voice of the book was an interesting thing because I tried so many different things. At first, I just wrote in the way that I speak. And then at another stage, I tried to sound more sophisticated. And then at some stage, I was like, I'm not getting this right. And then I don't know, there was a writers group that I was part of, and I was getting feedback and was speaking about voice. And I thought to myself, what voice have I been around with the kind of people I hang around with, the stages I've gone through? So I know that in East London, the people that are into underground hip-hop and graffiti on that scene, I remember how distinctly we would speak when we were that age. And I thought, oh man, I remember how we used to speak like this. So, in fact, some of my friends are in their 40s and they still speak like that. And so I was like, okay, this is easy, I can do this. And then so I started using it, or bringing out that voice. And it was just a balancing act of remembering that there's a lot of people who don't understand the slang that are going to read this book. So how do I then find the middle ground in that? And it was something that I've kept working on. But interestingly enough, I do a lot of work in schools with young people and in teacher development. And there's two things that I see happening all the time. The one, no one can tell how old I am. They think I'm a lot younger than I am. And then two, I find when I'm speaking to teenagers, it sort of brings out a teenager in me. So when I'm writing other stories, I'm finding this voice that comes out in that book is sticking with me. It doesn't want to go away. And rather than muzzling it, I'm like, okay, well, let's just explore where it goes out. But it's interesting because it's influencing what I thought I wanted to do as a writer. I have this big idea in my head that I'm going to be the Stephen King of Africa. You know, like I'm going to write horror stories. But every time I write a horror story, it starts off as a horror story, then it gets chiseled down and whittled down to this thing that becomes a human interest story with more of a psychological edge and the voices of a young teenage protagonist. That's what's happened with a number of the stories I've tried to write, starting them as horror. And so instead of fighting and resisting that, it's like, well, just go with it. I don't know where this voice is coming from. Maybe it's the teenager that went into a shell back in high school, coming out now that there's a way to come out. I don't know, but it's an interesting space to be in.
Gloria, is growth for you a third book, but with interconnected themes, characters, and a story that almost becomes a bookend for a story that you continued, that you started 3 years ago? Quality of Mercy. I think I've not touched on your first two, but just reading this and doing research, the characters like Emile Coetzee, who for you represents this sort of colonial statesman, as in the form of a police officer, very much. How is growth for you when it comes to writing?
So I think for me, you know, when I started writing the theory of flight, I really wanted to capture a moment that I was living through. I had lost someone who was like Onke, an older sister, but she was my aunt, and she had protected me through a lot in life. We were 4 years apart, and I was trying to come to terms with that loss. So she passed away suddenly when she was 34. So I was trying to, you know, learn how to navigate the world on my own, in that sense, for the first time. And I was trying to honor her in a way. And I wasn't necessarily thinking of doing a trilogy or anything like that. I just wanted to tell that story, and if that's the only story I got to tell, then that was great. But as I started working with the story and, you know, writing a lot of characters in that story, I realized I was actually telling the story of my community, where I come from, my family. And it was important to me to do that in different ways through these 3 novels. So this last novel, The Quality of Mercy, is dedicated to my grandparents for a very particular reason, because they were so instrumental in many different ways in allowing me to understand what it is to be from my ethnic group, which is Ndebele, which is a minority ethnic group, what it is to be from my grandmother, a woman, and what it means to be a woman and have a certain kind of power, and what it is to be a woman and use words in a certain way, and how that can also be powerful. And from my grandfather, I learned, so my grandfather was, like I said before, a political detainee, and he had these scars on his body. And I remember when I was 6 years old, I looked at him and I said, you know, because I understood a little bit about the history of my country, and I said, white people did that to you? And he said, yes. And I said, I hate white people. And he looked at me and said, what did white people do to you? And that was like the moment in my life where I was like, oh, okay. So I cannot just inherit something that I think is anger or whatever it is, or hatred, without necessarily understanding what the narrative around it is, right? And it shouldn't be that easy of a translation. I shouldn't just feel, so I think that's what my work tries to do a lot, is just like, let's just not be angry, let's not go there, let's like actually try and work through what this is that we've inherited. And I think that's the lesson that I got from my grandfather.
Look, when we look at the period of a must-fall movement, a Me Too movement, lots of social, political causes coming into the fore around about post-2010. You've also told us before, myself and Onke, that you decide to leave the US, to avoid a Trump presidency. And what those moments sort of thought, okay, we're post-race, we're post-gender, we're post-nativism. But if you look at particularly our relationship, mine, yours, South African, Zimbabwean, and we look what happens with the Operation Dubula movement here and this voice and this ugly head of xenophobia, are we in a post-systemic environment? And how does this now affect your storytelling now?
I think what the moment is trying to say to us is that we cannot be passive, right? We cannot just allow history to continue, right? Like we cannot say, oh, we went from apartheid to post-apartheid, we went from being a colonial country to, and just somehow hope that this is going to happen the way we want it to happen, whatever, because you realize that not everyone has the same idea of what that transition is supposed to be. Who belongs and who doesn't belong. I always felt in Zimbabwe we never had the moment to be a nation, right? We went from being a colonial country to being a without any talk about what that actually means. How do you bring these people together again? Like what does that look like? What's the work that needs to happen? Who gets to be a citizen? Who gets to belong? Like those kinds of, that kind of work and that kind of interrogation of our past needs to happen actively in schools, whenever, and when we don't do that, when we just assume there's like a niceness in all of us, that's just going to be try to be nice all the way through. That's just not how we see that now. That's just not how things pan out, And we can say that the world has taken a shift, but I think it's a shift that was always sort of like underneath everything, and it's a truth that we have to face, that not everyone, just as many people want there to be all this, kind of like, let's get to understand each other, let's get to know each other for the better, let's understand difference to make it something amazing. There are people who are like, difference is bad, and difference is dangerous. And how do those two groups of people talk to each other? And we never do. We always like just look at those people and say they're kind of crazy, they're kind of out there, trying to make America great and wearing, but like what exactly does that mean to engage? And I think in this particular part of the world especially, we need to start having those conversations, otherwise we're in a lot of trouble.
My overall thought on South Africa is that, yes, thank God for a peaceful transition between 93, not all that, not blood in the sense that people died and people were assassinated and there was lots of violence, but not all full-scale civil conflicts, so we thank goodness for that. But we've particularly in South Africa not had catharsis. There's not been a overall cleansing of South Africa. We went from one administration to another administration. Yes, the new administrator representing legally all of us, of course, but we haven't had that welcome. Let's talk about catharsis for you, particularly when we talk about trauma and loss, and in that finding yourself. What was your cathartic moment? Are you still going through a catharsis? You mentioned 32 is when your mom passed away. You'll be 32 years. Is that when you experience that catharsis because you'll be the same age as her?
Well, for me, the catharsis is certainly telling the story. Telling and writing the story. Writing this story was profoundly cathartic for me. And I certainly think there's, as a country, it is through storytelling that the catharsis, the cleansing, begins to happen. Because you cannot change, who was it? I mean, I think it's a famous quote, or someone said, you cannot change or fix something you don't understand. And I think by bringing these different accounts of trauma, of violence, of the repercussions that we have to deal with as a result of our past by giving honest, nuanced, vulnerable, and already said honest. It seems like I say that a lot, but by giving these accounts of how we move through and carry the legacy of our past, I think we're able to get to a point where we can see very clearly how we inflict violence on one another, because I think a lot of the violence we inflict on one another and ourselves we are not aware of it as violence or as a kind of behavior that is learned, that can be changed or transformed.
I'm just thinking now that at the death of Uyinene, who was
Yes.
killed in a post office, all of a sudden we have the pandemic of gender-based violence. Your mom was killed by a partner. You've lived with what mass media decides, oh, we have to report on the scourge of gender-based violence, when who you are now is essentially a result of the impact of gender-based violence inflicted on your mother.
Yes, I mean, I do write actually as well in the book about that Uyinene moment. And I was actually in Cape Town, and I was a media consultant for the World Economic Forum, where people were going to protest and say the president must come out and say something. And I was inside the establishment. And when I remember my friend called me and said, oh my gosh, they're coming, the protesters are coming to Cape Town. Be safe. And this is profoundly personal for me as well, you know. So I did say to the team, no, guys, we have to do the right thing, you know. Either he has to go talk to the people, or we have to distance ourselves from this and say that we do not accept this kind of behavior, but we have to do something, And of course, there was still a kind of young, youthful rage of, you know, things can move and they can move now in that moment. But that was a profound moment for me. And it happens a lot because women are killed a lot in this country. And you know, we have the trends on social media calling for justice, justice for so-and-so. And every time that happens, I am taken somewhere. Every time we say 16 days of activism against women and child abuse, I am taken somewhere. And often for me, it's not a great place, because it feels like, you know, a poster thing. It doesn't feel like a sincere effort to say, how can we move past this? It feels ceremonious, more than it's you know, meant to be impactful and radical and to change things. So, you know, and again, I did say it was important for me to tell and write this story, because it is my experience, but it's many other people's experience, and it's not spoken about with enough complexity, the kind of consequences and repercussions. And so I believe that the storytelling, that telling our stories, is really how we begin to heal. And people have asked me so many times, oh, you know, how have you been? How have you dealt with the tragedy, with the trauma? And the writing helped me. I wouldn't be here talking to you so effortlessly about the pain and trauma and overcoming that if I didn't sit at my desk and wrestle with these difficult emotions. And I think that process of sitting at my desk and wrestling with these difficult emotions and finding the words for these difficult experiences and understanding them fully and objectively for myself, I think that's something we all as a nation need to do in order to move forward.
We have about 10 minutes left. If Mervin's still here, you can raise his hand and ask if I ask politely to go 5 minutes extra. If there are questions from the audience, Erica, how are you doing? Is there a microphone for Erica. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Let's go then.
Well, we'll wait because this is all being recorded and streamed, so let's wait for the microphone to get your voice on a clear stream.
Hi,
morning.
thank you for just such a mind-blowing, amazing talk and chat, and I am so moved by everything. I do have a question about fiction writing, though, and I know this isn't a writer's workshop, but when you go into and you start writing your novels, do you already know the transformative moments that your character or your main characters are going to be experiencing, or is that something that develops as you write?
Gloria, let's start with you.
Okay. So I think yes and no. I mean, there's sort of certain things you want to happen, right? There's certain ways that initially you think you're going to go from point A to point B to C. But the process of writing is, as you know, it's its own thing, and it's got its own magic, and sometimes that's not how it happens. But I think it helps to have some of that in mind, like how you want, your character to get to this place, and sort of like how you emotionally also want to be able to be present for your character as they go through this. But I think it's you can plot all you want, you can do the character analysis, you can do outlines, but when it comes to writing, and my wonderful editor is here, so it's a process, and she'll be like, well, are you sure this should not be chapter 5, and not chapter 15, and then that's a whole rethink, so it is something that it's important to know, but it's also something to let go of, to just say, okay, this character is on a journey, I'm witnessing that journey, and I should just, be part of the witnessing of that journey.
Okay.
I think for me, I really like villains. So when, obviously you like the protagonist, that's why you'd write the story, but I think I start from a place of thinking about the villain, and when things go bad for the protagonist, I'm like, how can I make them worse? And I keep upping the temperature. And then by the end of it, I mean, I like a happy ending. So when the hero or heroine comes back from that, then it's like, it was worth it. And then people come in like, but that villain though. And then you just give the villain a good quality just to confuse people. So
It's what we think of Krillmonger
Yeah.
in Black Panther.
Yeah.
He's the villain in the story, but particularly in an anti-colonial context, you're like, no, he was
He's
right.
doing the right thing, yeah.
Go ahead, welcome.
Well, I didn't write fiction, but the transformative moments, certainly, I like that you said the writing process has its own magic, because I would have an idea of, I think this was an important moment to write about, like the Fees Must Fall moment, for example, the Winena moment, for example, and other moments in the book. I thought, I'm going to write about this. But when you sit down to write about that, the transformative moments come, and I have certainly been transformed, like so many times in the process of writing this book, because I realized so much of, what I carried, how I saw things, how I experienced things. And another also very important thing for me was my diary keeping, writing. I keep my diaries, and I have extracts verbatim in my book from my diaries. And going back through the diaries as part of writing this book was also transformative for me, kind of seeing how I was, applying myself and thinking deeply for a while on things I experience and encounter was also another transformative moment. So the transformative moments certainly come in the writing process, and I am certainly transformed every time I sit and I commit to writing something. And a friend of mine recently said something when I shared the similar sentiment, that one cannot expect other people to be moved by their work if you yourself are not moved by it. And I have been moved, and even when I do read some bits of the book now, or when I read, when I'm asked to read, I haven't like committed to reading it, but when I'm asked to read a piece, I'm transformed, and that's important. That was important for me when I was writing it to be transformed by the writing process.
Lady, sorry, you there by the gentleman? Sorry, it's right there. Ma'am, you'll be with you in a short.
Thank you. Siphiwe, I wanted to ask you about how you find the capacity to write Emile Coetzee. The difference between your voice in the first novel and the second novel is so stark. And is it research, or do you imagine yourself as him? I found it quite extraordinary how authentic his voice was in that novel, and a remarkable achievement. And so I'm really interested to find out how you got under his skin.
So no, I mean, I never thought I was Emile. The wonderful thing is that I love observing. So moments like this are very difficult for me because what I like to do is be there, looking over here. So I grew up in a very interesting moment in Zimbabwean history where it was like the 80s and 90s, and I went to predominantly white schools, and I think there was a lot of male patriarchal authority around me that had its roots in boarding schools and this very particular understanding of masculinity. Now, did I know that when I was 15? No. Did I know that when I did research as a graduate student? Yes. So I think he is a product of a lot of research, but also a lot of observation. It's also my way of, like I said, stopping to bang the doors when I was, this is my coming to understand the country that I was brought up in and all its injustices and how I was absorbing those injustices in many ways and not having the language. And I think I needed to write that kind of character because I feel like I inherited the world that people like him created, and I need to be very creative and very honest, to use your word, about how I see us moving forward. So he's an amalgamation of both observation and research.
Ma'am?
Thank you. Gosh, there's been so many wisdoms shared here. Thank you very much, all of you. And a lot of the things that you've said have sort of stayed with me. The thing about the magic, the process of writing has its own magic, and finding your voice, it's something interesting. But the particular one that I liked, Welcome, you mentioned about the writing and wrestling, and I thought, oh, that must be quite hard work. And Siphiwe, this is one for you, really, because there's something about, it doesn't feel like you wrestle with your words at all. It feels like you've fallen in love. It feels like you've fallen into this river of wonderful language. To what extent does the actual quality, to use your word, the quality of how you're writing, does that get in the way of the story? Because it feels like you have just swimming in this wonderful language. Does that feel like that? How does it feel?
I think that's
She makes it look easy. And I should say I edited 2 of the authors on the stage. Welcome one day. And it was very interesting hearing what you said about the villain and the dreadful things you do to your protagonist. But the thing is that like Siphiwe, and I haven't read your book yet, but like yours, there's always this kind of redemptive fizz. Yeah. And I had a very similar response to Simon, to The History of Man. I called that book an act of grace, because I thought, where did she get the compassion? And that was so much work. You could just see that it had been laid down. Likewise, I mean, you're now a therapist, yeah. And reading these books, fiction is not necessarily autobiographical, but there's something about the process of building compassion that then gets expressed in the writing. And I just think that I have, days like this, I have the best job in the world. But trust me, she makes it look easy, but she works at it.
Thank you, Helen.
That's the answer. Thank you.
I just have, in wrapping up this morning's session, in your professional world as being a psychologist, Onke, and particularly dealing with the issues of mental health, ideation, what also the last few years, decade has done is particularly made young people express issues around mental health, and we've largely, not completely, but largely normalized discussions around mental health, particularly over the last 2-3 years, and that's when you went back into private practice. How does, and with your voice talking as a young person in your book, how have we opened this discussion regarding young people, mental health? You express that some of the ideas that you expressed younger, you now see as a professional psychologist. There are signs of depression there. How do you see young people talking about their mental health?
It was interesting for me writing the book and thinking of my own mental health journey, and then also thinking about it as a therapist. My starting point was that I was trying to have a conversation with a younger version of myself, and if I was thinking of a target audience, which I wasn't doing much, but I thought it was going to be a book enjoyed by older people, even though it's a young person that the book's about. And I think the end product is one that can be enjoyed by people of different ages. And it certainly made me feel like I am trying to get the discussion to be normalized a bit more. I think today's youth may know the terms, and it can be a bit of a pandemic. Like if someone says, I have panic attacks, then the next one's like, I have them too. As long as I don't have to go to maths, then I have them too. Then it becomes misused in a sense. But then if someone is generally struggling with something, they still stigmatized, which then tells me that it's not as normalized as you would have thought going back. It almost seems not easier, but slightly different in my time where it wasn't spoken about. So you didn't dare say this is what you have and align it with where you are in your journey.
I said I'd start off this morning's session by asking how the parental figures in your life would have described you as a young person. I don't know how old you are now, but how, if your parents, your grandparents, your sister, aunt, or this morning, how would they describe Siphiwe?
So my mother loves to say that she's very proud of me, and then she spells the proud with like a gazillion R's, like, and she, it's been a journey, everyone knows mother-daughter relationships, but I think what she would say is she is happily amazed that I found what it is that I love to do, because I think for a while there, it didn't look like I was even trying, but like she loves that I write, and she loves that I'm so dedicated to it, and she loves that I'm telling stories about where we come from, so she is very proud.
Okay.
I think my mom would probably cry and she's not a very emotional woman, or she certainly doesn't show it. And growing up, I thought this is a very tough woman that is so obsessed with my older brother, her firstborn son, that I always felt like I didn't have a place, which is why my older sister filled that surrogate mother role very well. But then I realize now that I'm much older, she becomes speechless at the way that she's so proud, that, and my sister once told me that it's because she felt you are okay compared to your brother. He clearly needed her support more. And it took me a long journey to get to that point where I accept that and feel like, well, I can see that it's not that she doesn't have a special place for me. She does. It's just I don't know if words can describe it. I'm her lost-born child, and I sometimes get frustrated that she still wants to baby me, even now. So it's like, okay.
Welcome. The trauma that one faces often is re-traumatizing, and My apologies if I've re-traumatized or I've brought up
I
memories.
re-traumatized myself by writing the book.
But particularly, I find it interesting, next year you become the same age as your mother, the time that she passed away. What would she talk about Welcome Mandla?
She's very proud of me. I know that. She adores me. She adores my choices and my independence of spirit. Yeah, she's very happy with the kind of person I have become, and that is important for me because I've always said, my mom has always said that I was going to be a great kid. This kid is going to be someone great. She's said that, and my sole purpose, you could say, is to not make a liar out of her.
Yeah.
So she is proud, and she is not a liar because the kid turned out to be something. And yeah, I'm very. I mean, it's important for me. Yes, it's important for me to live my life out as loudly, as joyfully, as happily, as honestly, again, as I possibly can, because the tragedy is that she's not here, and she was not supposed to die. But the silver lining is that I am still here, and I get to live for the both of us. And when my time comes to go over to the other side, we will reunite, and she will talk about, oh, you shut it down at the Open Book Festival and other things.
But ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Please, a massive round of applause for our writers. I really appreciate your time here with us. Guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed this hour. Mervyn should really do like a open book BTS, where we go off stage and we continue just a little bit longer conversation with a glass of wine, even though it's only 11 o'clock. Somewhere it's after 12. But enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.